Hello, welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for collective liberation. I'm Aaron.
And I'm Damien. Thank you so much for joining us today. Each week, we'll bring something new to the table and discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Damien, you're up this week, and it's your birthday.
It is.
What are you bringing to the table today, birthday boy?
Thank you. Happy birthday to me.
Yeah.
I have brought an article from the latest issue of Hammer and Hope to the table for us to talk about today. Their 6th issue was released back at the end of April, I believe, and so it's somewhat still hot off the presses, and I'm really looking forward to reading all of it. But the piece we read for today is called Donald Trump and the Far-Right Insurgency in Europe. It was written by Gary Younge, who, as I mentioned last week, is a professor of sociology over at the University of Manchester and is also an author of several books. And actually, another fun fact about Gary Younge is that he also served as the editor-at-large of The Guardian for a few years as well, which is pretty cool. Yeah. But the piece we read for today is all about the history and rise and manifestations of right-wing politics and conservatism and fascism, both here in the United States and abroad in Europe. It focuses on the impact of fascist leaders like Donald Trump here in the United States, as well as fascist leaders and regimes really all over Europe, and places like Italy and Hungary and the Netherlands, Sweden, Finland, Portugal, Croatia, Belgium, just to name a few. There are a lot more mentioned in this piece. It also analyzes some of the other factors at play in these places that help contribute to the right-wing insurgency that has taken place really across the globe. And I really appreciated this piece for lots of reasons, but especially because it opened a door to the European perspective and experience that's connected, and very much so connected, to what we're going through here. One of the things Gary Younge says early on in this article is, quote, "From a European standpoint, the racism articulated by Donald Trump over the past decade has felt both familiar and foreign, making his most recent election victory both painful and predictable. Familiar and predictable because the xenophobia and bigotry, pronouncements about minorities that are either ahistorical, anti-historical, factless, facetious, or farcical, an embrace of a populist, corporatist nationalism are proving effective on both sides of the Atlantic. Foreign and painful because the particular targets, method, sophistry, and strategy are specific to the United States, and the impact of his victory will be felt all over the world." And it was that last part in particular that got me, because I think it really highlights how far-reaching and how damaging fascists like Trump are. And so I feel like I've talked a lot here. I've introed this piece, but it was really insightful, and I've very much so been looking forward to getting to talk about this one with you. So, yeah, where do you want to start?
Yeah, it is far-reaching because we have so much influence. The United States has dug its claws into so much of the world and so many corners of the world. And I think you look at things like USAID and the State Department, and we have military bases all over the world.
Yes.
There are all these different ways that a fascist here in the United States could really influence a lot of things around the world. And just the way that he likes to pretend to be a strong man also influences foreign policy. And I think we'll talk about that a little bit because that was in the article as well.
Absolutely.
It was really, it's really a great article. And it's such a great summary of where we're all at with this right-wing political activity and how these authoritarians work their way into winning elections or becoming popular.
Yes.
Because not all of them are winning, but they're getting enough support to generate a crowd.
Yes.
And generate some fans.
Some fame,
and that's fascinating too. And not fascinating in a good way, just fascinating. And so I really appreciate the way that he ties the fascist history in Europe to the way that the fascism and racism was and is operating in the U.S.
Yeah.
And some of the stories here were surprising, not because they were surprising themselves, but because I hadn't heard of them before.
Yeah.
Right? So the story about the black author who lived through the Nazi occupation of Paris only to then be harassed for the first time by U.S. troops.
Right.
Because he was drinking wine with his white wife out in public. And so that was an intense way to illustrate the connections and differences between Nazi fascism in Europe and the anti-black, white supremacist, segregationist fascism here in the United States. And the way that that then manifested into individual troops across the globe who had just liberated, so to speak, France. So I read that story and just stopped. And it's the second paragraph. I just stopped and said, wow, what? This is not something that I would have thought about. And yeah, it's just really fascinating history. And I appreciate him naming that.
Yeah.
And this author was never harassed during the Nazi occupation, but U.S. troops show up and this is what happens to him. Like just a few weeks into that, it really tells a tale of what was actually going on, and it tells a tale of how like Hitler and the Nazi Party were really influenced by race laws and what the United States has done to indigenous people here in this country in their own workings and machinations.
Yeah, absolutely. Funny enough, I read that and I sort of just thought, this is America, right? Like, the man was never harassed.
Yeah. Well, that's why it was surprising, but it wasn't surprising.
Right.
Like, I was not surprised that it happened. But simultaneously, I kind of was, and it was a very strange experience that I had in reading that.
Absolutely.
That story.
And again, so early in the piece, it really kind of set a picture for where we were going, and just again an incredible analysis and lots of connections in this piece that Gary provides us here. So speaking of that, actually, one of the other pieces of analysis that Gary offered was around how we got here in the United States, but especially in Europe. Like, how did this far-right fascism become so ubiquitous? So he says, quote, Europe and the U.S. have taken different paths to get to this point because their histories of migration, race, and class are different. European nations have an easier job of imagining themselves as monocultural entities without racial histories than the United States does for two reasons. First, their most egregious anti-Black racism and most effective anti-racist movements took place primarily abroad in their various empires, making deniability more plausible, ignorance about where they have been and what they did when they were there more widespread, and the legacies of cultures of resistance more remote. A Colonial Office survey of 1948, when Britain ruled over much of Africa and the Caribbean, found that half of Britons could not name a single one of its colonies. Second, compared to the U.S., people of color have been in Europe in significant numbers for far less time, and their numbers, while substantial, remain relatively small. In England and Wales as one entity, and in France, the two countries in Europe believed to be the most racially diverse, the proportion of non-white inhabitants stands at 18.3% and roughly 15%, respectively. In the U.S., it is more than double that. And so all of that to me was really fascinating because I haven't thought about or learned too much about how fascism has been able to spread throughout Europe. And so it was sort of a primer for me for that. And it really reinforced the fact that learning about history, and especially the history of how colonialism and imperialism and racism and all of those things have impacted the trajectory of our world, and how learning about history, and we've talked about this before many times, is just so critically important for all of us as a way to combat this kind of insurgency. And, it also, I think, reinforced how this far-right insurgency relies on things like lack of diversity and ignorance and disinformation to spread. And so there just was such great history presented here about the European perspective that I was really introduced here that I, again, just appreciated so much.
Yeah, and he sort of builds on that, and he talks about the ways that, as you mentioned, race is sort of viewed differently in Europe versus the United States, and he talks about some of the history of why that is. And you mentioned here the stark difference between people, the subjects of your empire, being at home and not seeing the things that you're doing abroad in your colonies versus that stuff being brought here. Right, through the slave trade in the United States or through the systematic murder of indigenous people. And so there's more witnessing that happens. And that's what he's named. That's the dynamic that he's naming.
In our face versus.
Yeah, and so then he's also talking about, I thought this was great. He talks about how racism as a hierarchy is fluid throughout the world. Which sort of continues on this thought, this train of thought. And so he quotes Stuart Hall in the article, who said, quote, "Race is more like a language than it is like the way in which we are biologically constituted." And Gary goes on to say, quote, globally, it is a language with many dialects. There is nowhere it is not spoken. In most places, it is easily recognizable. But in each place, it is spoken somewhat differently, with its inflections and idioms shaped by the economic, political, and cultural context in which it is expressed.
Yes.
So that's a concept that I understand, but I haven't thought much about it because how entrenched in this racialized system I am in the United States. And so I appreciate having my perspective stretched on that, as you said, learning a little bit more of a perspective that is different from my own.
Yes.
That is also, it's grounded in the same white supremacist, colonialist, imperialist, patriarchal stuff.
Yep.
It just has a slightly different twist on it.
Yeah.
That, it's helpful to know that twist or hear that dialect as well to continue the language metaphor.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, I appreciate that, and any opportunity to have your perspective broadened is great. One of the things it made me think of, and obviously I haven't traveled much abroad, but that concept felt familiar to me, just in this idea of anytime, as a person of color, as a black person, I go anywhere new, it's like, you've got to read the room. You got to figure out, especially traveling, even here in the States, different states have different ways in which they treat folks of color.
Different towns inside the same state.
Absolutely. And so you show up to a place and you walk into a store and you figure out, like, am I welcomed here? Do I have to have my guard up? And so that to me was how I related to that in a way, but again, I appreciate his analysis around it for sure. One of the other major pieces of analysis, I think, in this article that I really appreciated was the clarity he provides around how we understand the political challenges that we face, both here in the US and in Europe. So Gary says, quote, this time around, Trump's victory did not so much undermine our understanding of the political challenges we face as it confirmed them in three particular ways. First, just as Trump followed both Presidents Barack Obama and Joe Biden, the far right's rise has been facilitated by the inability of the establishment parties on the left or right to deliver for the broad swath of people who feel that their lives are getting worse. Much of the electoral base of these right-wing parties is a coalition of those left behind in post-industrial hellscapes and the middle and upper classes in rural and suburban areas who fear the cosmopolitan chaos of the cities. This is most evident in Britain and Germany, where center and center-left governments' inability or refusal to redistribute wealth, reinvigorate the economy, and establish a plausible narrative for how we got to this point and how we might get out is fertilizing the ground for the growth of the far right. In Britain, for example, the Labour Party won what has been called a loveless landslide in July 2024 with a low turnout, netting 5.7% fewer votes than when Jeremy Corbyn was leading the party from the left in 2019 in Labour's worst election performance in more than 8 decades.
Wow.
Within a few weeks, we saw white riots as far-right protesters targeted mosques and asylum seekers' shelters after a mentally ill black teenager who was neither Muslim nor an asylum seeker ran amok at a children's dance class, stabbing 3 children to death and leaving another 10 people injured. Just over 6 months later, polling shows that far-right Reform UK Party narrowly outpolling both Conservatives and Labour, potentially growing from 5 to 76 seats in Parliament. Yikes. So, yeah, there's a lot there. And so, but I think, in addition to that first way, our understanding of our political challenges has been confirmed. Gary then went on to highlight how the rise of the far right has generally been mirrored by an electoral collapse of the hard left, both here and in places throughout Europe. And it's sort of a second way. And then the third way that this has happened or has been confirmed is how center party leaders who once denounced leaders like Trump here and in Europe have come to stand beside those folks. And I think he highlights J.D. Vance as one of them. Like, you look at old footage of J.D. Vance kind of denouncing Trump, and now look where he is. And so, all of that was really fascinating to read about, and especially to sort of see the chain of events here in the U.S. is how it's so similar to the chain of events in Europe.
Yeah, and there's a ineffectiveness that I think is clear when you look at the Democratic Party here and Labor in the United Kingdom that really illustrates also the way the authoritarians are able to get their hooks in.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And that's part of the electoral collapse. But I think electoral collapse, he talks about this more than this one section that you shared. but electoral collapse doesn't really capture it for me, right? Like, because you could fail an election and have run an effective campaign.
Yep.
They're just not doing effective campaigns.
At all.
They're, as it does say this in this quote that you shared, they're just losing people because they are not weaving effective narratives. They're not reaching out to people. They're not providing alternatives to what has been very challenging times for some people.
Absolutely.
And they're not naming those challenging times either. And I think I think for me, I think that's a big part of the failure of these parties.
Yes.
You've lost them to other people because these other people say they have an answer.
Right.
And you've got more of the same.
You've got more of the same, right? But as you say, like, that's then why we have the rise of this right and the rise of this fascism that's allowed to sort of get its claws in and thrive.
Yeah. So another fascinating point that Gary makes in this article is about Trump's foreign policy maneuvers, which is, that's a generous term for what it is that he's doing. Maneuvers is one way to put it, I guess. But Gary says, quote, Trump's saber rattling toward China, Denmark, Canada, Mexico, the EU, South Africa, Palestine, Jordan, Egypt, Colombia, and Venezuela, and we're still only in the first few months, may well prove counterproductive, ending up uniting significant blocks of the world against him for the sake of their own self-preservation. This is effectively what is happening over Ukraine as I write, with European states coming together both to counter his proposals and to elaborate a new solution. So I read this and I said out loud, fingers crossed.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fingers crossed. I think some coordinated response to the idiocy of this man and his regime would be very powerful to see. And it would be a really interesting reorganization of power across the world, which may or may not hold beyond this particular presidency. It could be something that he organizes, by accident. He encourages people to come together against the United States in ways that they might not have otherwise without his, as Gary calls it, saber rattling. And so I think that that's going to be a fascinating thing to watch as world powers, as governments across the globe reorganize themselves and reorient themselves to what their relationship is to the United States.
Yeah, and what it is that we are all collectively experiencing with the idiocy of this man, as you call it. I love that. All right, well, why don't we shift our conversation over to application here? How does this piece and our conversation about it apply to our everyday lives and work? And I wanted to bring us here because I think my application is directly related to what you just talked about. So it worked out kind of perfectly.
You're welcome.
For me, what a birthday gift. It's a call to action that Gary offers towards the end of this piece around how we combat this far-right insurgency. So he says, quote, we cannot simply rely on them to make mistakes, not least because their implosion could lead to an even greater cynicism, despair, and reaction. We saw some elements of what an effective electoral resistance might look like in France. There, the left managed to rally communists, ecologists, and center-left socialists into a broad popular front for the first round of voting in July 2024, running on a manifesto of overturning President Emmanuel Macron's neoliberal reforms, imposing price freezes on essential food and utilities, and increasing the minimum wage by 14% and housing assistance by 10%. The new Popular Front coalition performed far better than any of them would separately. In the second round, which includes the top two candidates from the first round, along with any other candidate that receives 12.5% of the eligible vote, they made an electoral pact with the center to withdraw in favor of whichever candidate was best positioned to beat Le Pen's national rally in order to maximize the anti-fascist vote. The agreement proved incredibly effective in terms of defeating the far right, which was widely tipped to win, but the broader coalition could not cobble together a majority even though it topped the poll in both rounds. Still, this non-sectarian Popular Front approach at the ballot box, combined with an electoral program that promised clear material benefits to working-class people, managed to interrupt the rise of the far right, even if it could not reverse it. And so that was, obviously a specific example of what just took place in France.
Right.
But I think the broader call to action there and the application here is this idea that fascism and far-right authoritarianism can be defeated, but it's going to require a significant lift, a coordinated effort, and as we learned about in this piece, a global response and a global fight, I believe.
Yeah, and I think that's the ways that fascist regimes have been defeated in the past have not been at the ballot box, but that's because that those regimes made their way into power through the ballot box.
Yeah.
So there's a variety of ways to look at this, and I think that some of these regimes that you talked about, you named some of them, Italy, Belgium, a bunch of places have these super far-right parties that are, we could call fascist and fascist policies.
Yep.
And preventing them from being able to gain enough power to implement anything, I think is a big preventative way to do that, to stop them. And when they get in power, sometimes the ballot isn't the way anymore.
Absolutely.
Because they entrench themselves and they decide there aren't elections anymore. And we're just, it's a national emergency and we can't have an election and blah, blah, blah. So that's, so that just made me think about, the way that coalitions form to break up the power and the power grabs at the ballot box is really important. And what happens later, we also have to consider as a way of how fascism gets stopped.
Absolutely.
Tracks.
Right. And how we respond to that idiocy, as you talked about earlier. Whew, absolutely.
Yeah. So my application comes from a moment in this article when Gary is explaining how authoritarians gain popularity.
Okay.
So to go back to us talking about the sort of center and center-left parties losing track of what the stories are, this is what's happening as they lose track of their voting blocks.
Their constituents,
So Gary says, quote, "The far right mobilizes fear of the outside world in the form of aggressive nationalism and xenophobia. Their message goes, borders are being assailed by the world's poor, who are coming to drive down your wages, riddle your neighborhoods with crime, and undermine your patriotic integrity. And the nation is unable to tackle this onslaught because it is being undermined from the inside by overly generous welfare schemes that make the wrong people lazy and entitled, too rigorous regulations that make business inefficient, and civil rights policies that protect minorities while dividing and censoring people." And so I think that's spot on example of how this works. And it's my application because when we can help our friends and family and neighbors see that this is the playbook, these are the messages, we can help them know what's happening when someone like Trump comes around and promises to fix things, which is another way to stop people at the ballot box. I think we have to do both, like the political parties got to figure their stuff out and come correct to elections, and regular people, we have to help one another and organize one another to be, I guess, literate about what it is that's happening and what are the choices that are being presented to us. And also recognizing that the choices that are being presented to us are super limited. And so there's a broad spectrum of understanding what these political systems can actually deliver to us. And so, I want to name that too, but we have to be able to spot when our fears and our pain are being taken advantage of for the benefit of a corporatist grifter who wants to make the system work even better for himself and his rich buddies.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I love that quote just because all of it is rhetoric that we have heard in these first 100 and however many days we're in. So it's absolutely spot on. And I think you're absolutely right. We have to be able to talk about this with each other, with our neighbors, with our families, with our friends, and understand what it is that we're hearing and what it really means and how it is going to manifest itself into a way that, we may not be able to recover from if we allow it to continue. Absolutely. That's great application. All right, well, let's talk about homework now. What do we want to do to continue our learning and unlearning work once we leave the table today? There are quite a few fascist, far-right, conservative, you name it, leaders mentioned in this piece from Europe that, as difficult as this might be to do, I'd like to read up on and learn more about. Some of them I was introduced to for the first time. And I think I want to do that only because of what we're experiencing right now with Trump, and if there's anything I can learn from this ridiculous playbook that it seems like these leaders, work from to understand, and particularly the ones from history, to understand where we might be going. I think it might just be helpful to be armed with that knowledge.
Sure.
So that's one piece. I'd also love to read some of Gary Younge's books, including Who We Are and Should It Matter in the 21st Century? The Speech, the story behind Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream, which I think you said you've read, and then Another Day in the Death of America. Ooh. So, I mean, that sounds like a fascinating title. All of those sound great. So I'm going to do some more of a deep dive into Gary's work. Yeah. What about you?
Yeah, he's a great writer, so we should definitely read some more of his work. I did read The Speech a while back. I'm not sure when, but it's sometime between 2013 when it was published and a few weeks ago.
Oh.
So, I'm not sure. Not sure exactly when. I went to go look it up on, Goodreads, where I keep track of what I read, and the dates aren't there.
Oh, well, okay.
So I don't know.
So sometime in the past,
Sometime in the past 12 years.
13 years. Yeah. Okay, great.
I know that's helpful. But I would also like to read some more of this issue of Hammer and Hope, because there's always so much great stuff in these issues, and I scan through, and there's definitely a lot of great stuff. Yeah.
There's so much greatness in this issue, per usual. So yeah, that's great. All right, well, that's it about this incredible piece from Gary Younge. Definitely check it out if you can. And Aaron, my friend, you're up next time. What are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
Well, how about we do some of my homework?
Okay.
I'm bringing Between Fires in Los Angeles and Fascism in America by Robin D.G. Kelley from this latest issue of Hammer and Hope to the table.
Yes.
The tagline is, quote, Altadina's vision of regeneration is the antidote to the political conflagration that threatens us all. So this should be a great read because it's Dr. Robin D.G. Kelley.
Yes.
And it's also about how Altadena is really trying to avoid the parasitic disaster capitalism that usually digs its way in after disasters like these LA wildfires we saw a few months ago.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this was when I was deciding between pieces. This was definitely one of them. So I'm very excited to read this one. Very good.
Yeah.
All right.
Hammer and Hope, double.
Come on now. Yeah. I like it. All right. Well, with that, we want to thank you for joining us today. You know what we want you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with everyone you know. Follow us on social media, including Instagram, TikTok, and Blue Sky. Check us out on YouTube and sign up and join us on Patreon to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes, thank you so much for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about all of us. And we'll talk to you next week.